The Ayer Mill Clock Tower in Lawrence, Massachusetts stands 267 feet tall. Its four glass faces are 6 inches smaller in diameter than Big Ben's. When the clock first chimed on the night of October 3, 1910, it could be heard across the entire Merrimack Valley, and its illuminated dials could be seen from nearly every rooftop in the city. What nobody standing on those rooftops that night would have believed, what nobody could have believed, was that they were listening to the high water mark, that everything the clock was built to celebrate had already begun to end, and that the clock itself would outlast all of it. But to understand how a city of 94,000 people, producing more worsted wool than any place on the planet, could fall so far that it would one day rank among the poorest cities in Massachusetts, with a median household income roughly half the state average, you have to go back to the beginning. And what makes Lawrence different from every other American industrial city is that Lawrence had no beginning at all, not a natural one. There was no village here first, no crossroads, no harbor, no trading post. In 1844, the spot where Lawrence now sits was farmland and woods. The city was designed on paper before a single brick was laid. The men who designed it were not dreamers. They were the richest, most calculating families in New England. The Lawrences, the Lowells, the Appletons, the Jacksons, interconnected by blood and marriage and trust funds, collectively known as the Boston Associates. They had already built Lowell upstream on the Merrimack. They had built the railroads that connected their mills to their markets. They controlled most of the textile industry in New England and a good portion of Boston's civic institutions. Harvard, Massachusetts General Hospital, the Boston Athenaeum. These were men who had made their first fortunes in the clipper ship trade with Europe and had learned to despise the unpredictability of the sea. What they wanted, above all, was control. Control of supply, control of labor, control of the river itself. In 1843, a consortium led by Abbott Lawrence visited Bodwell's Falls on the Merrimack, about 25 miles north of Boston. What they found was a stretch of river dropping just 5 feet through farmland. Not much to look at. But an engineer named Charles Storrow saw something else. He saw that if you dammed the river, really dammed it on a scale nobody had attempted, you could raise the water 30 feet and create enough power to run more spindles than any city in America. The group allotted $50,000 to buy the land. In 1845, they petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to incorporate as the Essex Company, and on April 16th of that year, they got their charter. Abbott Lawrence himself was a fascinating figure, the son of a Revolutionary War veteran who had fought at Bunker Hill, a self-made Boston merchant who had served in Congress, who would later be named U.S. Minister to the Court of St. James's. He gave $100,000 to establish the Lawrence Scientific School at Harvard. The city would carry his name. But Lawrence himself was really a financier, not a builder. The man who actually made it happen was Storrow, the Harvard-educated engineer who surveyed every street, designed the dam, laid out the canals, and later became the city's first mayor. If Abbott Lawrence was the venture capitalist, Charles Storrow was the founder doing the work. The plans for the Essex Company were so popular with investors that they raised $1 million in less than a month. Think about that for a moment. $1 million in 1845 to build a city that did not yet exist, on a river that had not yet been dammed, to manufacture cloth that had not yet been woven. It was the most audacious industrial bet in America at the time. The contractor, Gilmore and Carpenter, won the construction bid, and the first stone of the Great Stone Dam was laid on September 19, 1845. An army of Irish laborers, many of them famine refugees fresh off the boats, did the actual digging, cutting canals through bedrock with picks and shovels, hauling granite blocks into the riverbed by hand. The work was brutal. Men drowned, men were crushed, but the dam rose, stone by stone, for exactly 3 years. The last crest stone was set on September 19, 1848. When it was completed, the Great Stone Dam was the largest in the world. 900 feet of granite across the Merrimack, 35 feet thick at the base, narrowing to 13 feet at the crest. The whole thing held together with hydraulic cement injected into the rubble, an engineering innovation so sound that the dam still stands today, still in excellent condition, still owned by the Essex Company's successor. The dam cost roughly $250,000, a fraction of the capital raised, which left plenty of money to build everything else. And build they did. Within 3 years of incorporation, the Essex Company had completed the dam, dug 2 canals, the North Canal running parallel to the river to divert water through the mills, and a South Canal on the opposite bank, erected 50 brick buildings, organized gasworks, established a machine shop powered by twin Fourneron water turbines that built locomotives as well as textile machinery, and put into operation the Atlantic, Cotton, Pemberton, Upper Pacific, and Duck mills. The Boston and Maine Railroad introduced passenger service to Lawrence in 1847, connecting the new settlement to Boston in under an hour. A city materialized from nothing. By 1848, what had been empty pasture 3 years earlier held 6,000 people. By the 1850 census, the brick walls of manufacturing establishments ran nearly a mile along both banks of the river. Lawrence was incorporated as a city in 1853, with Charles Storrow, the engineer who had built everything, elected as its first mayor. Now here is the thing about a city designed as a machine. Everything works beautifully as long as the machine runs. The Essex Company didn't just build mills. They planned the streets, the lots, the boarding houses, the churches, the schools. They controlled who bought land and where. It was, in the language of the time, a model industrial city, the nation's first. And for a while, the machine ran magnificently. By 1860, Lawrence had over 20 mills employing around 10,000 workers, and the city had become the worsted capital of the country. The Pemberton Mill alone, with its 2,700 spindles and 700 looms, was pulling in an estimated $1.5 million a year. But the Pemberton Mill is also where the story gets dark, and it gets dark fast. On the afternoon of January 10th, 1860, a Tuesday, the middle of the workday, around 800 people were at their looms inside the Pemberton when the building simply folded. No warning. A section of wall bulged and exploded, and within seconds the entire 5-story structure collapsed into a pyramid of twisted iron, splintered beams, and pulverized brick, 30 to 50 feet high. The sound was heard blocks away. People described feeling the ground shake like an earthquake. The Pemberton had been built just 7 years earlier. The cause, investigators would later determine, was faulty cast iron columns and understrength mortar. The building had been sold in 1857 during a financial panic to new owners who had crammed it with additional heavy machinery to increase their margin. The structure couldn't take the weight. But the collapse was only the beginning. 2,000 people rushed to the site and began clawing through rubble, pulling out the living and the dead. They worked for hours by lamplight, and then, around 9:30 that night, someone knocked over an oil lamp. The wreckage caught fire. People who had survived the collapse, who were trapped and conscious and calling for help, burned alive. Rescue workers standing feet away could hear them singing hymns. The death toll was somewhere between 88 and 145. Accounts vary because some of the bodies were never recovered, consumed entirely by the fire. Most of the dead were young women, Irish and Scottish immigrants, many of them teenagers. The New York Times ran the story on its front page the next morning under a headline that read, in the stacked typography of the era, "Horrible calamity. 500 persons in the ruins. 200 operatives killed." The numbers were inflated in the chaos, but the reality was bad enough. The engineer who had designed the building, Charles Bigelow, the same man who had overseen construction of the Great Stone Dam, denied responsibility. An investigation determined that the cast iron columns had been defective, some of them so riddled with flaws they should never have been installed. No criminal charges were filed. The Pemberton Mill was promptly rebuilt. That detail, rebuilt on the same spot with little consequence for the men who had cut corners, tells you something important about Lawrence in this era. The city existed to make money. The workers were replaceable. The investors were not. And for decades after the Pemberton collapse, this arrangement held. New waves of immigrants arrived to replace those lost or injured, and then to fill the ever-expanding mills. The Irish had dug the canals, and they stayed. French Canadians fleeing hardscrabble farms in Quebec came next. By 1880, over 3,000 of them, and by 1910, nearly 9,500, the largest immigrant group in the city. Germans arrived after the upheavals of 1848 and settled in a community of about 2,500. Swedes came from an overcrowded homeland. Each group staked out its own neighborhood, its own churches, its own social clubs. Lawrence became, in the phrase that would stick, the immigrant city, a place where you could walk 5 blocks and hear 5 languages. Then, around 1900, the composition shifted again. Italians, Poles, Lithuanians, Syrians, and Russian Jews arrived in a torrent. The Russian-born population alone reached over 4,000 by 1910. Holy Trinity Church went up for the Poles. Lithuanian Catholic and Lithuanian National Catholic parishes formed within blocks of each other. The Jewish community centered around the Common, where many worked as merchants and shopkeepers. On Essex Street, the main commercial thoroughfare, the storefronts reflected this Babel. Signs in English, Italian, Yiddish, French, Arabic. According to the 1910 census, 65% of mill workers had been in the United States less than 10 years. Nearly half had arrived within the previous 5. The population doubled, then doubled again. By 1900, Lawrence was home to over 62,000 people, and the city was still growing. But the man who would push Lawrence to its absolute peak, and whose personal arc mirrors the city's in ways almost too neat to be real, was William Madison Wood. And he is worth pausing on, because his story is unlike any other industrial titans. Wood was born in 1858 in a cottage on Pease Point Way in Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard. His parents were Portuguese immigrants from the Azores. His father's real name was Guilherme Medeiros Silva. Silva is the Portuguese word for wood or forest, and he was a crewman on a New Bedford whaling ship. He died when William was 12. The boy dropped out of school and went to work in the Wamsutta cotton mill in New Bedford, where a wealthy manufacturer named Andrew Pierce saw something in him and gave him his start. Wood was brilliant, relentless, and ruthless about efficiency. He married Ellen Eyre, the daughter of Frederick Eyre, a successful Lowell merchant who had bought the failing Washington Mills in Lawrence for $328,000 at auction. Eyre tore down the old narrow buildings. Some were 9 stories tall, sold the old machinery for roughly what he'd paid for the whole complex, and built a new mill with modern equipment. But Eyre didn't know textiles. He needed someone who did. Through his foreman, Thomas Sampson, he found Wood, who arrived in Lawrence in 1886 at a starting salary of $1,800 a year. Within a decade, Wood was treasurer of the Washington Mills, and the operation was turning a profit while competitors were going under. The Wilson-Gorman tariff of 1894 had slashed import duties, flooding the American market with cheap foreign cloth. Wool mills across New England were bleeding money. Wood's solution was consolidation. Bring the failing mills together under one roof, cut redundancy, reinvest profits into new machinery instead of paying them out as dividends to trust fund heirs. He organized a meeting at the Waldorf Astoria in New York in 1899, and 8 struggling woolen firms merged into a new entity, the American Woolen Company. Wood became its president. What happened next was an industrial expansion unlike anything the textile world had seen. Wood convinced investors to let profits flow back into the business. He bought failing mills across New England, in Rhode Island, Maine, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, and turned them around one after another. At the company's peak in the 1920s, American Woolen operated 60 mills across 8 states, employed tens of thousands, and controlled 20% of all the woolen fabric produced in the United States. School children in Lawrence memorized the slogan, "We weave the world's worsted." But the crown jewel was in Lawrence itself. In 1905, Wood built the Wood Worsted Mill, named without modesty after himself, on the banks of the Merrimack. It was the largest single mill building in the world. 6 stories of brick, 1,300 feet long, a third of a mile, with 17 miles of interior aisles. It employed 7,000 workers on the day it opened in April 1906. The thing was so big it could take raw fleece and turn it into finished fabric entirely under one roof. The mill processed the wool of 600,000 sheep in 5 hours. And then, because even that wasn't enough, Wood started building the Air Mill next door in 1909, named after his father-in-law. It opened on October 3, 1910. And rising above it, the crowning gesture, the symbol of everything Wood had built, was the clock tower. 267 feet, the largest 4-faced chiming clock ever installed in a mill, its faces 6 inches smaller than Big Ben's. The tower had a practical purpose. It told the 7,000 arriving workers when their shift began. But it was also a declaration. Lawrence, Massachusetts, a city that hadn't existed 65 years earlier, had erected its own Big Ben. By 1905, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the total value of Lawrence's factory output was over $48 million, with Worsted's alone accounting for nearly $31 million, more than any other American city. The population was still climbing. It would hit its all-time peak of 94,270 in the 1920 census. If you had stood at the base of the Air Mill clock tower in 1910, looked up at the illuminated dials, and then looked out at the mile of red brick mills lining both banks of the Merrimack, you would have been looking at one of the wealthiest manufacturing cities per capita in the world. And yet the clock had barely begun to chime before the first crack appeared. On January 1, 1912, a new Massachusetts law took effect, reducing the maximum work week for women and children from 56 hours to 54. 2 hours. Mill owners across the state had a choice: absorb the lost production or cut pay proportionally. American Woolen, under William Wood, cut pay. When workers at the Washington Mill and the Everett Mill opened their envelopes on January 11th and 12th, they found their wages reduced by 32 cents a week. 32 cents does not sound like much, but the average weekly wage in the Lawrence mills was under $9. A third of workers would die before their 25th birthday from the conditions inside the mills: the lint-filled air, the deafening noise, the unguarded machinery. These were people already at the margin. 32 cents was several loaves of bread. On January 11th, a group of Polish women in the Everett Mill noticed the short pay, shut off their looms, and walked out. They marched from mill to mill, shouting up at the windows, "Short pay, all out," in Polish. By January 12th, thousands had joined them. Eventually, more than 20,000 workers walked off the job. They spoke over 24 languages. Many had been in the country less than 5 years. The American Federation of Labor wanted nothing to do with them. The AFL organized skilled English-speaking craftsmen, not immigrant women. So the workers turned to the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, who sent organizers like Joseph Etter, Arturo Giovannitti, and the legendary Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. What followed was 2 months of chaos. Meetings were simultaneously translated into nearly 30 languages. Workers organized soup kitchens and nurseries. They formed a 50-person leadership committee with representatives from every nationality. The singing picket lines, the Internationale in a dozen tongues, snaked for blocks through the commercial and mill districts. The city and the mill owners pushed back hard. The governor called out the state militia. Workers were beaten. An Italian woman named Anna Lopiso was shot and killed during a confrontation, though the exact circumstances remain disputed. Ettore and Giovannitti were arrested for her murder, even though they had been miles away when it happened. And then, in a detail that captures the whole bitter dynamic, it was later discovered that a mill contractor named John Breen and another man named Ernest Pittman had had planted dynamite near the mills, apparently to frame the IWW and discredit the strike. When authorities traced the serial numbers on the dynamite back to Breen, he confessed. The money trail led to William Wood himself, who had paid Breen $500. Pittman committed suicide before he could testify. Wood was indicted for conspiracy, but acquitted in June 1913. He never adequately explained the payment. The national publicity was devastating. When workers began sending their children away to relatives in New York and Philadelphia for safety, the children arriving at train stations with identification tags around their necks, newspapers covered it, and public outrage forced Congress to open an investigation. By March, the pressure was unbearable. On March 12, 1912, American Woolen agreed to every demand: a 15% pay raise, double pay for overtime, and amnesty for all strikers. Other textile companies across New England raised wages to avoid their own uprisings. The workers won. The ripples spread through every textile company in New England. Mills that hadn't even been struck raised wages voluntarily, afraid of being next. But something had shifted that could not be unshifted. The world now knew what it cost to make a yard of Lawrence worsted. Every newspaper reader in America had seen photographs of the militia with fixed bayonets surrounding peaceful marchers. They had seen children with tags around their necks being loaded onto trains. They had read about a woman shot dead on a picket line, and about dynamite planted by a mill owner's agents. The deal between the city and its people, cheap labor in exchange for steady work, had been publicly broken, and the mill owners understood, perhaps for the first time, that the labor force they depended on was not merely an input to be managed. It was a force that could organize, resist, and win. That realization would echo through every boardroom decision for the next 40 years. William Wood kept building. In the early 1920s, he constructed Shawsheen Village in neighboring Andover, arguably the most unique textile mill village ever built in New England. It wasn't worker housing. It was a planned community for American Woolen's upper management. Colonial revival homes designed by 8 different architects, a commercial center, its own Boston and Maine train station, a bowling green, playing fields, and a professional soccer team called the Shawsheen Indians that competed in the American Soccer League. Wood hired architects, landscape designers, and a civil engineer named John Franklin to lay out the entire village under his personal direction. Homes were sold or rented through a company entity called the Homestead Association. It was, in miniature, what Lawrence itself had been in 1845, a community drawn on paper by one man's vision, financed by one company's money. During the First World War, American Woolen's government contracts for military uniforms and blankets produced staggering returns. The company was turning out 40,000 miles of cloth per year, and Wood's margins were extraordinary, so extraordinary that the Department of Justice indicted him and the company in 1920 under the Lever Act for wartime profiteering, claiming profits of 300% to 400% on government contracts. One newspaper called it bold profiteering, nothing else. Wood staged a 40-piece brass band of his own employees to greet him when he arrived at the courthouse. He was acquitted. But Wood was deteriorating. He suffered a series of strokes. His son, William Jr., was killed in a car accident. His good friend, a World War I hero, was driving. On February 2, 1926, in Daytona Beach, Florida, William Madison Wood, the Portuguese whaler's orphan who had built the largest textile empire on earth, who had started at $1,800 a year and become one of the richest men in America, took his own life. He was 67 years old. Within months, the residential and commercial buildings of Shawsheen Village were being sold off. By 1932, a realty trust had purchased most of them. The soccer team folded after losing its financial backer. Wood's model community, like Wood's model company, had been held together by one man's will, and when that will ended, the structure unwound. With Wood gone, the whole edifice began to wobble. No one else had his particular genius for making the impossible machinery of 60 mills work in concert, and larger forces were already in motion that no amount of genius could have stopped. Through the 1920s, textile producers had quietly begun relocating to the American South, to the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, where labor was cheaper, unions were non-existent, winters were mild, and state governments were eager to offer tax incentives. Cotton didn't need to be shipped north anymore. The mills could go to the cotton. The Great Depression hammered Lawrence, but not fatally. The military still needed wool. The Second World War brought a temporary boom. Government contracts for uniforms and blankets flooded in. Employment spiked, wages rose. But the boom was artificial, sustained entirely by wartime demand. And when that demand disappeared after 1945, the math became merciless. Then came the Korean War. American Woolen landed enormous contracts supplying the military. The company had been the sole supplier of woolen fabrics to the U.S. Armed Forces through both World Wars, and Korea looked like it might save them again. For a moment, it looked like Lawrence might hold. But when the armistice came in 1953, the contracts evaporated overnight. The company, which had staffed up and kept aging mills running specifically to fill government orders, was left overextended and virtually bankrupt. Between 1951 and 1954, American Woolen announced the closure of 14 major factories across New England, including 3 in Lawrence. The layoffs came in waves, each one worse than the last. 6,500 workers at the Washington plant, 2,800 at the Air Mill, 3,000 at the Wood Mill, the building that had once employed 7,000 people under a single roof. At the time, Lawrence already had the worst unemployment rate in the nation. In 1955, a man named Royal Little, a Harvard graduate who had founded a small company called Textron, completed what Fortune magazine called the stormiest merger yet, a hostile takeover of American Woolen. Little's stated philosophy for picking targets was blunt. Be sure to pick a company whose board of directors isn't smart enough to fight back with a counter takeover. He later wrote a book with the remarkable title, How to Lose $100 Million and Other Valuable Advice. Little had no interest in wool. He had spent years arguing that the future lay in what he called non-related diversification, owning businesses in completely unrelated industries so that a downturn in one couldn't sink the whole enterprise. He wanted American Woolen's remaining assets and its balance sheet, not its looms. Textron sold off the textile holdings piece by piece. By 1963, the company had divested its last textile operation entirely. Today, Textron manufactures Bell helicopters and Cessna aircraft. It is a $12 billion defense and industrial conglomerate. The wool is a footnote in the corporate history. In Lawrence, the machinery stopped. And because the city had been designed as a machine, because every street, every canal, every building had been laid out for one purpose, there was nothing left when the machine went silent. The numbers are stark. The population, which had peaked at 94,270 in 1920, fell to roughly 80,000 by 1950 and kept falling to around 64,000 by 1980, the lowest point. The families who could leave did leave, following the new highways to Methuen, Andover, North Andover, towns just a few miles away where the lawns were bigger, the schools were better, and the air didn't smell like lanolin. Between 1969 and 1988, the city lost nearly half of its remaining 18,000 manufacturing jobs. The recession of the early 1990s wiped out another 5,000, 20% of the city's entire employment base, gone in a single downturn. The tax base cratered with the population. Buildings that had once generated revenue for the city stood vacant, generating nothing but maintenance costs. The school system deteriorated. Crime rose. The story was the same one playing out across the industrial Northeast: Lowell, Fall River, New Bedford, Bridgeport. But in Lawrence, it was more extreme, because Lawrence had been more single-mindedly devoted to one industry than any of them. And what happened to the physical city was almost worse than the economic collapse. Half of the enormous wood mill, once the largest mill building in the world, was demolished in the 1950s. A wrecking ball swung against the north wing while photographers documented it. The fourth floor leveled, debris piling up in the courtyard, the clock over the entrance still visible as the walls came down around it. The photographs are at Cornell now in an archive. Then came urban renewal. In 1959, the Lawrence Housing Authority hired a local photographer named Anthony Ciaffollo to document the downtown before demolition began. A kind of before and after project, except nobody involved seemed to question whether the after would be better than the before. Under the banner of revitalization, the Lawrence Redevelopment Authority raised entire blocks of the downtown through the 1960s and 1970s. The granite neoclassical post office on Essex Street, where the postmaster's son had watched his father work for a quarter century, was torn down. Movie theaters were demolished. Whole neighborhoods were bulldozed. In their place went parking lots, a 3-story parking garage, and an in-town mall designed to compete with the newly constructed suburban shopping centers that were draining the city's retail dollars. The cleared land was offered to developers for a wide range of uses: retail, offices, laboratories, hotels, apartments. 21 acres sat empty for years waiting for bids. A McDonald's stands where the post office once did. The 12 million square feet of mill space lining the Merrimack, more total square footage, someone once calculated, than all the football fields in America combined, sat vacant and deteriorating. Some of the buildings were the size of skyscrapers lying on their sides, and they were empty. In 1984, tensions between the city's remaining working-class white population and a growing number of Hispanic residents, Dominican and Puerto Rican immigrants who had arrived in the late 1960s, drawn by cheap housing and the same promise that had drawn the Irish a century before, erupted into a riot centered at Haverhill and Oxford Streets. Buildings burned. Over 300 people were arrested. Then, in 1991 and 1992, a wave of arson swept through the city. More than 200 buildings were set on fire in 18 months, most of them abandoned residences and industrial sites. And then, on the late afternoon of September 13, 2018, a Columbia Gas contractor working on a pipe replacement project in South Lawrence made an error. The low-pressure gas distribution system was overpressurized. Across Lawrence, Andover, and North Andover, houses began to explode. Over 60 fires erupted. 8,000 people were displaced. An 18-year-old named Lionel Rondon, who had just gotten his driver's license, was sitting in his car when a chimney from an exploding house crushed him. He was the only fatality, though 25 others were injured. The property damage exceeded $1 billion. Columbia Gas was fined $53 million and was barred from operating in Massachusetts. A city that had already been abandoned by industry, gutted by urban renewal, and scarred by arson, was now literally blowing up. It would be easy at this point to end the story with a moral, to say that Lawrence proves the danger of building a city around a single industry, or the cruelty of absentee capital, or the inevitable decline of manufacturing in the Northeast. All of those things are true as far as they go, but they are true of a dozen cities. They are not the particular truth of Lawrence. The particular truth of Lawrence is that it was never really a city at all. It was a product. The Essex Company designed it the way you would design a factory: inputs, outputs, efficiency, control. The Boston Associates didn't build Lawrence because they wanted a community to thrive. They built it because they needed a place to convert water power into textile profits. Every canal was dug to serve a mill. Every street was laid out to move workers to their shifts. Every boarding house was built to keep labor close. The dam, the canals, the mills, the housing, it was a single integrated system, and the system had one purpose: to make the shareholders of the Essex Company wealthy. When that purpose was served and then surpassed by cheaper alternatives, the system had nothing to fall back on. Lawrence had no port, no university, no state capital, no diverse commercial base. It had wool. And when wool left, it had 12 million square feet of empty brick. Some of those buildings are coming back now. The Washington mills have been converted to mixed-income housing. The wood mill, what's left of it, the surviving half, has been turned into condominiums called Monarch on the Merrimack, with a geothermal heating system and artist studios. The air mill, where the clock tower rises, is owned and occupied by New Balance, the athletic shoe company. The Essex County Community Foundation manages the clock tower's endowment and employs a keeper to maintain its works. In 1991, after the tower had fallen into disrepair, the bell missing, the glass broken, pigeons nesting in the mechanism, a restoration effort raised over $1 million and brought the tower back. A new 6,000-pound bell was installed. The clock chimes again. The population has rebounded somewhat to about 89,000 in the 2020 census. More than 80% of the population is now Hispanic, making Lawrence the most heavily Latino city in New England. The median household income is around $60,000. The poverty rate hovers near 18%, nearly double the state average. There is a bitter irony in the last American woolen factory in Massachusetts. It wasn't in Lawrence. It was a small operation in Uxbridge that had bought the trademark and specialized in woolen blankets, holding on until 1987. That year, following a property tax reassessment, the owners decided they could produce more cheaply in the South and relocated to Miami, Florida. Massachusetts' last link to the company that had once controlled 20% of the nation's wool output was severed, not by bankruptcy, not by foreign competition, but by a tax bill. In 1987, the Boston Globe covered a reunion of the surviving Lawrence strikers of 1912 and their children on the 75th anniversary of the walkout. The youngest of the original strikers were in their late 80s. They gathered in the shadow of the mills where they had once shut off their looms and walked into the cold. What you see if you drive through Lawrence today depends on where you look. Some blocks are vibrant. Dominican restaurants, bodegas, small businesses threading themselves into the old commercial streets, the same streets the Essex Company laid out in 1847. Some blocks are not. The Merrimack still runs past the mills the way it did in 1848. The great stone dam still holds. And the air mill clock tower, 267 feet of brick and copper, its 4 glass faces glowing above the river, still marks the hours. It chimes on the quarter hour now, just as it did on that October night in 1910, when 7,000 mill workers looked up and saw their city's monument to permanence lit against the sky. No one winds the clock for those workers anymore. The wool is gone, the company is gone, the industry is gone. The families who financed the whole enterprise moved their money elsewhere a century ago. But the clock keeps time. It is the most precise thing left in Lawrence, measuring with mechanical indifference the distance between what the city was built to be and what it became.